Welcome, everybody. My name is Lana Anderson, and I'm the moderator for today's webinar. I work for the Institute for Human Services, IHS. I am, like I said, your moderator for the webinar, and I will just take a couple of minutes to tell you a little bit of who we are, what we do, also explain some things pertaining to today's training, and introduce our presenter for today. IHS's core work involves assessing organizational and system practice, building capacity to achieve best practices through education, training, coaching, and technical support, and helping organizations navigate through every step of the developmental process to better protect and serve children and strengthen their families. We also work internationally, helping child welfare organizations throughout the world. For those who purchase CE credits through Eventbrite, you will need to attend the webinar in its entirety and complete a short evaluation after the training. The link will be sent to you at the end of the session. So our trainer for today, Pamela Miller. She's a senior policy analyst with the APSAC Center for Child Policy. She has background as an attorney for abused women and girls and a clinical social worker with focus on severe child maltreatment. She also serves as an expert witness in litigation related to child maltreatment. In her work with APSAC, she's leading a multi-year project on intrafamilial child torture. In her psychotherapy practice, Miller treated young survivors of intrafamilial child torture, ICT, on a specialized foster care team. She studied with Dr. Judith Cohen to become certified in TF-CBT, studied with Dr. Bessel van der Kolk to become certified in body-based trauma treatment, and trained with Dr. Bruce Perry in the neurosequential model. Miller is also trained in TheraPlay, PCIT care, child-centered play therapy, and attachment-based play therapy. She has won multiple awards as board member and regional director of the National Association of Social Workers of Ohio. Miller has served as counsel for amicus APSAC in 2 cases before the Ohio Supreme Court, authoring several amicus briefs regarding ICT and the biopsychosocial impact of severe child abuse. She also authored several resources on ICT in the past year, including policy reports, amicus briefs, lectures, and a web article on the interplay of coercive control and intrafamilial child torture. She also co-authored with Lisa Aronson Fontes, which now has over 2,500 views. Miller's papers and trainings have been accessed by professionals from 81 countries in the past 16 months. So that is our trainer. Another professional who will be helping us today with Q&As is Dr. Judith Reiches. Judith is a program director and the director of international child welfare at the Institute for Human Services, IHS, in Columbus, Ohio, an organization that she co-founded in 1977. She's a senior policy analyst with the Center for Child Policy, and she manages the center's operations. Dr. Reiches has spent her professional career as a consultant, policy analyst, trainer, and training manager in the fields of child welfare and child protection. She has worked throughout the United States and Canada with countries in Eastern and Western Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America. Dr. Reiches has written and published journal articles, book chapters, training curricula, and training development resources. She's the lead author of the 4-volume resource textbook, The Field Guide to Child Welfare, published by the Child Welfare League of America. She's also an organizational development specialist, providing program evaluation, strategic planning, and consultation to promote systemic and large-scale change in the child maltreatment profession. Dr. Reiches has a doctorate in development psychology and a master's in social work. So with that said, Pamela and Judith, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me today. As Lana said, we are a couple of years into a long-term project on intrafamilial child torture at the Center for Child Policy, which is operated by IHS. And I'm so happy to have you with us today. We do have, today we are going to be talking about the impact on child victims that have experienced ICT and professional interventions. We will give an overview as well as some specific recommendations. If you'd like to know more about what is ICT, we do have on our website an introductory webinar that solely looks at the development of the concept of ICT. We'll go over it briefly today, but if you want to learn more, that might be a good place to start.
Before you begin, I'm sorry. My job is to monitor the questions and answers, and unless you know where to ask them, I won't see them to answer them. This is a small enough group that we hope it'll be very interactive and that you will all be involved. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see Q&A. Just type in your questions as we go, and we'll pause periodically to have Pamela answer them. Okay.
Thank you so much. All right, here's our brief introduction to what is intrafamilial child torture. So one of the first major papers on child torture in families was a work group led by Dr. Barbara Knox at American Family Children's Hospital. They published an article in 2014 where they pooled 5 colleagues, pooled 28 cases that they considered child abuse rising to the level of torture, and attempted to develop a definition of child torture that could be used by a child abuse pediatrician in a forensic setting. So they said, we define child torture as a longitudinal experience characterized by at least 2 physical assaults or 1 extended assault, 2 or more forms of psychological maltreatment, and neglect, resulting in serious harms. So they said prolonged suffering, permanent disfigurement or dysfunction, and unfortunately, death in some cases. This definition was designed to be highly specific, to count different forms of maltreatment in order to give criteria so that child torture could be respected as a diagnosis by a child abuse pediatrician. And this was a widely circulated paper that gave some folks their first introduction to the concept of child torture in families. Although for many years before this, many authors had published case studies or other articles that talked about severe child abuse and used the term torture kind of intermittently. And here it starts being developed as kind of its own concept, which is what we eventually arrived at. So here's some of what I just said. So in this definition for child abuse pediatricians, both physical and psychological are torture required to meet their definition. Of course, many of us in the field of child maltreatment believe that anytime there's physical or sexual abuse, there's always a psychological harm component. Under their definition, psychological torture alone would not meet the definition. And that is their attempt, obviously, to fit kind of the role of a pediatrician that's looking for, bruises and scars and different things like that that can be scientifically and medically measured. They said prolonged or permanent harm was necessary to meet their definition, and much of that is consistent with what we've seen in our cases. In this article, the authors start to describe some of the family dynamics at work in ICT, which was very helpful. But they did not include anything about the family dynamics or about the parent perpetrators in their definition. And this may have been strategic. We think that family dynamics and parent characteristics are very important. But obviously, if someone is doing a one-time forensic evaluation, they may not have much information about the perpetrators or whole family. And so the authors didn't want that to prevent anyone from making the diagnosis of child torture. And this is being used in many places. Our term ICT for intrafamilial child torture is being used in North Carolina, specifically Dr. John Wright at East Carolina University will make diagnoses of ICT. And there are several places now throughout the country where our trainees are using this in the context of forensic medical exam. Another article, a law review article by an attorney, also came out in 2014 that addressed, the article began by presenting a case of ICT that this author had worked on when he was a law student intern. And then he offers what is, I would call either sort of philosophical or theoretical research on the concept that didn't have the term ICT yet, but he, I think, child torture by parents or child torture in families. And this really definitely reads like a true law review article. So he says knowledge that one is torturing another person should be enough to convict someone of torture. So in the law, they're very concerned about what was the person's mental state. So he's saying you shouldn't have to prove that it was purposeful because that's going to make it too hard to convict these parent torturers. Knowledge, the parent knows what they're doing, should be enough. The definition should not require proof of pain or suffering on the part of the victim because the torturer's actions are just as wrong, whether the victim is more or less resilient. And this is really fascinating to me with my law background because in the law, going all the way back to the beginning of our country and even English common law, the outcome for the victim absolutely determines the severity of the punishment for the offender. So for example, in our country, attempted murder is less of a punishment than completed murder. So in that case, if a victim goes to the hospital, whether they live or die, changes the punishment for the offender, even though the offender did the same wrongful act. And it looks like here Brown really wants to get out of that because of the seriousness of child torture and these people being some of the worst offenders of any violent offender. He said there should be no temporal requirement. You can torture your child over a weekend or over years. And he said there should not be a requirement of both physical and psychological torture, that true psychological torture should be enough to put parents in prison. So at the Center for Child Policy, which was created by Institute for Human Services that runs it, as well as APSAC and the New York Foundling. In 2021, we developed a working definition of intrafamilial child torture and coined that term ICT based on pretty massive kind of literature search and case data that we had. So we have collected data on 48 children who were tortured in their families. We've looked at and identified some trends and commonalities. We are going to be starting a major data collection project, collecting both quantitative and qualitative data starting in 2023. And hopefully we'll have a new paper for you in 2023 with some more empirical information. We are taking names all the time of folks that have had a case, even one case of ICT in their career, or think maybe they have. And if you would like to contribute that information to our project, please get in touch and let us know. At the end, I'm going to list some email addresses and our website to get in touch with us. If you're not sure if you've had a case of ICT, reach out and we'll talk with you about it. So this is kind of the background, short overview of like developing the concept of ICT. And then of course, once we did that paper in 2021, we did a webinar on that. What is ICT? The very next most obvious burning question is, how is this affecting children and what do we do to help them? So that's where we're headed today. This is our working definition of ICT. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. You're going to get a copy of the slides. So don't worry about trying to write down any of this. But let's just look at the words that I put in bold here. So we say that ICT is systematic, deliberate, intentional. I use the word deliberate another time, planned in advance, sometimes methodical and purposeful. And so I highlight these words because for us, this is the most important part of what makes ICT as opposed to just, physical child abuse or psychological child abuse. We know from the scientific study of child maltreatment that most cases of child maltreatment involve neglect. And we know from physical abuse cases that, it's quite common for, there to be, a lot of stresses on the family. Parent loses their temper, hits the child, maybe beats the child, and afterwards is remorseful, is willing to accept social services, go to counseling, go to parenting classes, so they can become a better parent. Might be some resistance to cooperation with government agencies or authority, but that more common situation is fundamentally different from a parent who we believe many of them have their own psychological need to torture another person, and things are planned, methodical. There are certain tortures that you get for certain offenses. Sometimes it's purposely spontaneous, but there is an intent to terrorize and destroy another person, to destroy their sense of self, to break them, to break their will. And we find that to be the one of the fundamental ideas underlying ICT. I'm going to stop at this point since I've given you a lot of information in our first 20 minutes, and want to see if there are questions or comments.
Go ahead and ask them in the question and answer if you have them. There's nothing posted right now.
Is the chat function enabled or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, one comment. My father was a pediatrician and a pedophile. He molested my son from the ages of 4 to 10 and did all of the above referenced behaviors. My son is now 23 and only recently disclosed this horror to me. My dad died in March and we're lost. Dad also had thousands of photos of his male patients that I turned into law enforcement.
Wow. I am so sorry to hear of your suffering, your family suffering, your son suffering. I'm glad you're with us today. And like I said, we're going to talk about treatments, and I'll try to reference things when I can. Although we're talking about child survivors, many of these treatments and the core components of the treatments may be helpful for your son. And again, don't try to write everything down. We'll give you a copy of the slides, and hopefully we can be of some help to you today, and to know that, at least you are not alone in this. Professionals know that's happening, and we're trying to equip the child maltreatment professions to be able to respond.
Thanks you very much. Second question, you stated about ICT being prosecuted. How much has this changed? I recall in the past that parents were rarely prosecuted.
Sure. So if you want to take a look at, I think it's our first paper, maybe our first webinar. I can follow up with more details. I know we did get some information about criminal prosecutions. There are a number of states that have torture either as like an aggravated circumstance to raise, felonious assault to a higher felony. There are places that have actual child torture statutes. which would include Delaware, and I think Hawaii is developing their first one right now. I would say that, you know, of cases that come to the attention of Child Protective Services, which is where I have somewhat of a background, it is true that very few cases overall that come into CPS are ever investigated by the police or lead to a prosecution. But I see it happening more and more, which is encouraging. I think the fundamental thing that determines prosecution is what I'm going to call bodily evidence. If the child comes in with, you know, 10 different injuries consistent with torture, fairly likely that the prosecutors are going to pick that up. If they come into care at a time where wounds have healed, there's non-specific scars and wounds, meaning they can't tell that it was from torture. If there, you know, is use of psychological torture like solitary confinement and things like that, that don't leave scars and marks, I think folks are less likely to criminally prosecute. I believe fundamentally that anyone who tortures their child belongs in prison, and that it's not enough just for CPS to come and take the kids away, that is not justice for those children. And even if you solely appeal to incapacitation of the offender, we know in some of these cases, because offenders have such a strong need to torture someone, many times when they get their kids taken away, they find someone else to torture. So another kid ends up in their home, or a young adult, or someone like that. So I think, you know, the answer is advocacy with law enforcement and prosecutors to educate everyone about ICT and the importance of criminal prosecution. Thank you for bringing that up. It's a very important point.
No other questions right now. You can move on.
All right. All right, this is a little bit of what we talked about before, but I wanted you guys to have it on the slides. So, you know, and this is taken right out of, you know, I can, for each one of these items here, cite just dozens and dozens and dozens of articles. We know a lot about what I'm going to call typical CM. By typical, I mean the most common, most frequent cases that come to the attention of CPS through like a hotline phone call. So parent mental illness and substance abuse, those two are just right up there. And when they both occur together, you know, obviously parenting and all sorts of adult responsibilities like parenting are hugely affected by untreated mental illness or substance abuse. Unemployment and poverty have a huge impact on child maltreatment. Direct impact would be like in neglect that has to do with, you know, non-intentional neglect. So there's no food in the home because we lost the food stamp card and we don't have any cash. We already put the cash towards the rent. Things like that, or child doesn't have their medicine they're supposed to have because they couldn't afford the medicine. And there are indirect effects as well. So maybe there was an incident of physical abuse as a result of just building stressors, more stressors on the family, which included, you know, particular incidents of poverty or loss of a job or something like that. Lack of parenting skills. Particularly, we know, of course, child maltreatment is generational. So if you were hit growing up and that's the only parenting skill you've ever seen modeled, that might be just kind of naturally what you turn to, even if you don't have, you know, real malicious intent towards your child. Lack of understanding of children's needs at different ages. This one is huge, particularly like for the youngest children, that, you know, a parent may ask the child to do something that is not realistic for their age, like go clean up your room for a 3-year-old, and then they come and the 3-year-old hasn't cleaned up their room, and there's, you know, inappropriate child maltreatment used. It's important for all parents to be educated about all the different stages and what's realistic for your child. We know that kids with disabilities and special needs, increase stress levels in families and are often suffer more child maltreatment. I've worked on a case where a child with a lot of disabilities and special medical needs was actually the targeted scapegoated child for torture, for ICT. So this is really a significant risk factor for kids at all sort of levels of and types of child maltreatment. Obviously, if families lack relatives, community members, neighbors, what we call, in social work, natural supports, they're not going to have that kind of buffer to help them when stress levels go up or crisis occurs. And family in crisis, those are just the things that happen to all of us. Someone dies, someone loses a job, a family member gets arrested and goes to jail, a family gets evicted. All those things that raise stress levels are things that we see leading to typical child maltreatment. And we give that to you because we want you to see that visually on the slide and then compare it to what we have here on this slide. So just from a preliminary look at the 48 cases that we've collected and clinical data as well from like therapists treating kids who have survived ICT. These are the underlying factors that we see. So parent desire for dominance and totalitarian control, like control even over the smallest stuff that you wouldn't even imagine, like control over how you brush your teeth, or control over how loudly you breathe, or control over, if they think you've got the wrong expression on your face. Parent desire for total submission and a blindly obedient child. Scapegoating is a huge factor. I've worked with so many sibling groups where one child is targeted, either only one child is tortured, or one child is receiving by far the worst of the torture among their sibling group. And there is a really great article by Hollingsworth on scapegoating that I can get to you guys if you, I can probably just Google it, but we can get it to you if you want to take a look. Parent personality disorder seems to be a factor. Now, obviously, this is not exclusive to ICT. You can scapegoat a child for other types of abuse. Parents have personality disorders with other types of abuse, but these are the ones that we're seeing appear quite commonly as a trend among those 48 cases, including, I would say, I hesitate to say borderline because I think there's a lot of stigma there and misunderstanding. I think, I agree with the scholar Judith Herman that borderline is often misused and overused with women to kind of stigmatize women who have survived trauma. We're going to talk today about like complex PTSD and developmental trauma disorder, and as opposed to like using personality disorder, but this is more like antisocial personality disorder. And many of you who have been in the field for a while will know that there used to be something in the DSM called being a psychopath. We call the condition psychopathy, and that was taken out of the DSM at one point and sort of renamed and reworked as antisocial personality disorder. But folks who study psychopathy are continuing in their work because there are some key differences between psychopathic traits and antisocial traits. The main one being that folks with antisocial personality disorder, by definition, tend to be in trouble with the law a lot and less sophisticated in covering up their behavior. Whereas in the idea of psychopathy, it's quite common that the person with psychopathy would have never been in trouble with the law because they are excellent at deception, they are excellent at manipulation. So that's kind of what we're thinking about parent personality disorder. parent manipulation of the child. So things like gaslighting, which I'm sure most of you know is just total 100% absolute denial of someone else's reality, to the point where they actually begin to question their own reality and their own beliefs about what has really happened, and deploying what they call misinformation. So this would be like, in one of the case studies that we're going to point out to you that we have on our website, teenage girl named Julie. Her father would tell her, if you ever disclose, what's going on at home to someone, like a teacher at school, they'll come and they'll put you in something called foster care. And in foster care, it's basically just a ruse for prostitution, and you'll have to be a child prostitute to pay for your care. And that'll be so much worse for you than just dealing with us at home. That's my key go-to example of misinformation. Conditions of captivity or enslavement. So I've seen families where they literally use language about slavery and have almost like an extreme Cinderella child that has a different role from the other children and serves the family hand and foot. Conditions of captivity, lots of families and perpetrators, perpetrators use language about the child being a prisoner, giving them prison food, literally using like solitary confinement and locking the child up or chaining them up, locking them to something. As you hear some of this, I hope what some of you are starting to think is, some of this sounds so extreme that it's like almost not believable. And that is exactly what we're getting at, because so many cases have happened where a child was not believed because their disclosure sounded so extreme, so fantastical, that you almost couldn't believe that this would happen. But we know that it happens, and we want people to know that it happens. And this is final point here, the parent torturer, we think, and we're going to, look into this further as we keep going with our ICT work. The parent may be psychologically dependent on the child victim to play out the torturous interpersonal dynamic. And when that kid gets taken away, that need is not being met for the parent, which puts other folks at risk. And again, if you want to learn more about the basics of ICT, what is it? We got a whole paper, a whole webinar on that, that we can direct you to at the end of our training today on our website. Before we move on, any further questions about family dynamics?
If you have questions, put them in the chat. And if not, we'll move on.
Okay. Judy, any comments you want to add or anything else?
Nope.
Okay.
Not right now. I think you've covered it well. I see no questions, so
Okay.
I will stop you if something pops up here as we move forward.
Absolutely. So normally when I train in person, I have people get into small groups and pass out written case studies and have them do, various exercises from, generating new ideas, coming up with answers, role playing, different things that are really difficult to do in a webinar setting. So what I want to do is give you information about where you can look at these case studies and do some self-study on your own. And we've got all of our materials in one place on our website, so it won't be difficult to find. It's just, well, we'll give it to you, Center for Child Policy's website, our page on ICT. So I mentioned teenager Julie is our sort of like intro to ICT case study, where this particular case that I worked on, I sort of feel like is almost like a textbook case with so many different aspects of ICT occurring in this this family and for this survivor. So you'll be able to get, you know, the lived experiences of the actual child victim, not just, you know, professional interpretation of it. You'll be able to identify different types of maltreatment the child was exposed to in order to identify that ICT is occurring. Identify clues that you sort of get from parental and family dynamics. The case study kind of walks you through some of the involvement of CPS, times that CPS didn't act, and then times they finally did act and remove the child permanently. And it also looks at things we're going to talk about today, like the long-term developmental consequences of having survived ICT. And also exploring what I'm calling here the effectiveness of different service systems. You know, how well are we serving these kids? How well are different systems talking to each other and collaborating, like mental health system to the child welfare system to the school system, things like that. So here's a direct link. If you want to follow that, you'll get the slides with the direct link. You can also go to centerforchildpolicy.org and click on issues, and then click on intrafamilial child torture.
Pamela, on second thought, I do want to back up to make just a couple points.
You want to back up to the family underlying factors?
Right, exactly. And you don't have to go back to the slide, but these are just a couple of things that you've said, but I want to make sure people really are clear about it. Pamela was really clear that we have limited empirical data. We have a lot of case data. And what the descriptors that we're giving you come primarily out of case data, but also out of the study of torture in other contexts. So there's a strong empirical basis for what happens to people in other kinds of torture. And we have case data showing that very similar things happen in families. And our main contention is that torture does occur in families as well as in a lot of other places. Part of the issue that Pamela also mentioned is that it's often not seen. It's not recognized. One of the reasons is that it sounds so egregious that people don't believe it. But the other issue is that it's usually encompassing several different types of maltreatment, and we suspect that many cases of torture are actually coded as child sexual abuse or child physical abuse. And people not knowing enough to look for torture because they don't know that it exists tend to look at it more as in a silo as a different kind of maltreatment, and then don't go do the deeper assessment to look for torture. So I think part of the goal here is recognizing that these conditions, this is not a clear identifiable list of things that you will see. These are things that you likely will see. And part of our data collection strategy is to get more empirical data to back all of this up. The more important point, and I think Pamela will talk more about it later, is that you need to look at this in terms of the whole concept of family-centered practice and prevention and all of the early support services that are becoming so prevalent in the child welfare field. And it has to raise the question, if child maltreatment and typical child maltreatment is driven by lots of external stresses, lots of external factors, a lot of internal conflict, family-centered practice is absolutely the right thing to do. But it raises a question because the dynamics in child torture are so very different, whether or not this whole family-centered practice is in fact the right intervention. And we have concluded that in most cases it is not. And I want to put that on the radar to help you understand the importance of looking at intrafamilial child torture as a subcategory, and a very unique subcategory of child maltreatment, and probably needs to be not only studied more, but the interventions need to be potentially very different than what we're doing with the rest of abuse and neglect.
Yep. And You can take a look at that first paper and first webinar, and or if you get in touch with us if you want me to come to your agency and provide some of these trainings. But I absolutely believe from all the ICT cases I've worked on and all the sort of study and development of ideas that we've done at the Center for Child Policy, that the appropriate intervention, the appropriate child welfare intervention is not work towards reunification and family preservation, but instead the concept of rescue and true child protection. And so that will, obviously require very specific responses from many different fields, but especially child protection agencies. We talk in another training, I think we may mention it today, about the ability to go straight to termination of parental rights in aggravated circumstances like torture, rather than giving the parents a period of 1 to 2 years to do services and rehabilitate. So thanks, Judy, for bringing that up. And we'll go ahead and keep going. So there's the Julie case study for you. The Kelsey case study and the next one about a 4-year-old named Melissa are in one document because they're about victim impact and treatment, the topic of today. So you've got a direct link there that you'll get, and another same direct link. And again, you can also go to centerforchildpolicy.org, click on intrafamilial child torture. So now we are going to go into the meat and potatoes of today, victim impact and intervention. So this is just sort of to give you an overview so you can kind of organize in your mind where we're going. The first thing we'll talk about are clinical diagnoses of ICT child survivors. So this is for mental health folks or assessors or anyone that needs to think about like a DSM diagnosis for kids. ICT is a type of child maltreatment. It's not a diagnosis, but there are many diagnoses that we think are appropriate. And we'll talk about several. The one that I feel also is most appropriate for most ICT child survivors is a concept called developmental trauma disorder. And we will take a look at that and the sort of 13 categories of symptoms in that disorder. It's not in the DSM, but we'll talk about that a little bit in attempts to get it in the DSM. We're also going to talk about neurosequential assessment based on the work of Bruce Perry, what he calls the neurosequential model of therapeutics. And we're going to talk about interventions. We'll give you sort of an overview of the types of psychotherapy interventions, medical interventions we've got to make sure kids get. We've already started a little bit on talking about child welfare interventions. Very briefly, we'll talk about obviously the need for individualized education. We also will talk about spiritual intervention. We've been lucky enough to have Victor Veith, who's I think probably the country's leading expert on children's spirituality and need for spiritual care in cases of child abuse. And then we're going to give you some specific interventions that just an overview. There'll be just one slide on each type of evidence-based treatment that we think will be helpful. And, if you're interested in getting further training on some of those specific things, we can definitely connect you and see what kind of services we can provide you. So this is the agenda, and we'll get started with clinical diagnoses of kids who have survived ICT. So you can see I've got 3 colors here, and those are important. The light blue at the top are diagnoses that are in the DSM-5. The green in the middle refers to a completely different diagnostic manual called DC 0 to 5. that is solely diagnoses for young children and infants under 5 years old. When I first saw it, I thought, no, the DSM is the real one. What is this? And then I realized that like some of the most respected infant and early childhood mental health folks in the country and in the world are writing this manual to, sort of fill some gaps left by the DSM. And then in the bottom in purple, those are some diagnoses and concepts that have attempted to get into the DSM-5, but not had any luck so far. Let me see, did I make a slide about no? So we're going to stay on this slide and I'm going to kind of talk you through each one and we'll take questions. So in the DSM-5, there is post-traumatic stress disorder, which we're all familiar with. And the regular PTSD criteria will say for children over 6, so we're talking about children 7 to 17 years old, here are some symptoms that you might see. And then also the DSM-5 gives a completely different set of diagnostic criteria. I mean, much of it is the same thing, but some things are different, called PTSD in children 6 and under. And this really focuses on, things completely unique to children, like what we call play reenactment, where children act out in their play, things that they have seen, things they've experienced, traumas. That can be a form of, rather than saying, oh, I'm having an intrusive memory, I'm having a flashback, which is a sort of very adult and kind of early PTSD conception of symptoms. We'll say, well, the child is constantly reenacting it in their pretend play. So really 2 options there, the criteria for kids 7 to 17 and the PTSD in children 6 and under. And they made some great changes. I mean, it's greatly improved from the DSM-4 TR when this came out in 2013 for the DSM-5. It's really hard to believe that this is now 10-year-old stuff. And of course, the science in it then is 15 or 20 years old. So I'll be excited to see what they come up with. I know that the DSM-5 TR is already in the works. Reactive attachment disorder. In DSM-4 TR, there was just, as far as attachment disorders, there was reactive attachment disorder, and there was the inhibited type where children are withdrawn and don't respond to other people. And there was the uninhibited type where children, will easily go off with a stranger and hug somebody they don't know and ask to go home with them. And most clinicians that I've worked with say they didn't like that dual system because all the kids they worked with attachment issues would have symptoms from both categories at different times. So we waited to see if maybe we would get like a spectrum disorder or some change in that direction in DSM-5, and we did not get that. What they did is they split reactive attachment disorder into 2 different disorders. Reactive attachment disorder became only the inhibited type, and disinhibited social engagement disorder is obviously the disinhibited type now. And I think it's a little confusing for me because, it's saying, okay, what is the issue that in this disorder? Social engagement. Well, kind of, but I would love it if it would say attachment, attachment 1 and attachment 2. But this is what we've got. And, some of the leading attachment scholars in our country have addressed that down in purple. Any questions about DSM-5 diagnoses for ICT survivors before I go on to talk about the one in the middle here? Okay, here in the middle, there is, you can Google them, it's called the 0 to 3 Project. This used to be called DC 0 to 3, and the whole manual was on just children up to 36 months old. And then as they got more science, they really realized that, maybe it was more appropriate to continue this all the way up to age 5. And, kids develop at different rates. So it may be, very applicable for some 5-year-olds and not for others. One of the key components of this diagnostic manual is that they conceptualize all infant and early childhood disorders as at least having some attachment and relationship component. Because no matter what your issue is, how your primary caregivers respond to you is going to affect your symptoms. So they have PTSD in there, and it has its own criteria. Some of it overlaps with the DSM children 6 and under, and some of it doesn't. They have attachment disorders in there in a way that I really like. And they have something fairly new called a relationship disorder. And the way that this came about is that, Charles Zena, who we talk about down here, probably the leading attachment scholar in the US, at least my favorite one. And he helped develop this idea of relationship disorder from looking at children in the foster care system and saying, okay, the child has a lot of problems when they're with mom, but when they're in foster home, they're doing okay. So it's something about the specific relationship that their problem behaviors are tied to. And they said it's not fair for the child to have to carry the stigma of having a mental illness, mental health diagnosis, when it may very well be the parent who is really the problem. And so the sort of compromise is, we'll call it a relationship disorder so that it's understood that this child is not having mental illness at home or at school. As far as ICT survivors, symptoms can be quite prevalent across environments. Although there are certainly some exceptions to that, particularly with older children who experienced torture maybe at a later age and already had a solid early childhood, that they are able to function fairly well when they're not somehow tied to the torturing environment. Okay, let's talk about any questions about that alternative diagnostic manual. Okay, let's look at the purple. So Judith Herman, I always credit her as the sort of founder of the modern trauma movement, because she wrote a book that made trauma and PTSD part of our everyday language as just to laypersons, right? Regular people know what PTSD is and what trauma is, in part because of the movement that she was a huge leader in. So Judith Herman published both an article and a book in 1992, introducing the idea of complex PTSD. Now, complex PTSD for her is not limited to children. She talks about it in the context of child abuse and in the context of young women who have suffered intimate partner violence that is quite severe, including to the point of torture. And she just does an amazing job in both that book, Trauma and Recovery, and the paper in explaining how young women tend to be really stigmatized, who have been traumatized, tend to be really stigmatized, get a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, and at that point just really kind of written off as crazy, rather than understanding that they have a trauma disorder that is amenable to treatment. And now we know all about neuroplasticity and things like that. And so I just encourage you, even though it's older, I still get out my Trauma and Recovery book and go through the child abuse chapter. She uses the word torture many times. And if you read that chapter, it's actually, she's really talking about child torture the whole time, although she only intermittently uses the word torture. It's not about typical child abuse. It's about really, really severe child abuse. She's tried forever to get complex PTSD in the DSM, and they just won't do it. Disorders of non-attachment. So this Charles Zena guy here, Tulane University, is one of the main leaders of this DC 0 to 5 stuff. He thinks that something that's missing from the DSM is something called disorders of non-attachment. When a child has never had the opportunity to form a healthy attachment or even an unhealthy attachment to any specific consistent caregiver, they have a much more profound symptom presentation than you would expect in, I guess, whatever is the typical presentation for RAD or disinhibited social engagement. You can Google this. He's got several articles on it. One with Neil Boris, who now heads up Circle of Security, which we'll talk about today. And I find this very helpful in sort of understanding the full spectrum of attachment issues, particularly if a child has experienced torture kind of from the beginning. They're very likely to have this disorders of non-attachment symptoms. I'm going to skip down here. We'll tell you real quickly. We're about to talk about do a little bit of a medium dive into developmental trauma disorder. And then right here, you see I have neurosequential model of therapeutics. Now, this is not a diagnosis, but it's a diagnostic tool. It's for assessment and for treatment planning. It's not a treatment, but very useful for the assessment and treatment planning. And what Perry says is he gives you sort of 32 developmental tasks that you have to accomplish from starting in utero all the way till you're a fully formed adult with your own identity, beliefs, and values. He has an order, a sequence to the 32 tasks, and says that, you know, he has the sort of neuroscience to back up that the brain has to do these things in this order. So that's the only way it'll work. And that what you would do is you assess how many of the 32 things are problematic, abnormal, totally dysregulated for the child, whether it's as simple as like their heart rate is always through the roof, which is something that starts to be regulated in utero, to, you know, do they have like executive function skills? And so when you kind of map out, some people call it brain mapping. I think that's an oversimplification. When you map out where their troubles are, it gives you sort of a good idea of, it gives you a diagnostic picture, even though it's not a diagnostic name. Any questions about these before we move on? I know I kind of spent a long time on this, but this is one I get a lot of requests for, you know, for folks that have to do diagnostic assessments for these kids. Judy, any comments?
Nope, nothing in the chat. Nothing in questions.
Okay.
The only thing, just for any of you who work internationally or interested in work internationally, Zena, a lot of his work came from studies of orphans in, you know, very young children raised in orphanages in Romania, which historically have been the worst conditions for children, but it's really useful in tracking out what happens with complete and utter deprivation of very, very young children. And there are a lot of parallels to what happens, as Pamela was saying, with very young children who suffer torture. So it's worth looking at. You can Google the studies and find them fairly easily.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest areas of overlap with children raised in orphanages where there's so little staff, they're not getting held, they're not getting cuddled, they're not, you know, getting that type of attachment work done, is real young kids who are left in solitary confinement as a form of torture. because it's that same idea of like an environment of total deprivation. So thanks for mentioning that, Judy. All right, so this is our like medium dive into developmental trauma disorder. Bessel van der Kolk, I consider like Herman van der Kolk and Perry kind of really the biggest leaders of the child trauma movement. And normally the traumas they're talking about are interpersonal trauma and in forms of child maltreatment. So van der Kolk said, for these kids that have suffered really severe interpersonal trauma, i.e. abuse, there are sort of 13 key symptoms that we see. These are all validated by rigorous empirical study that he had to do for his DSM-5 trials. And he may have, they may have been repeats also of attempts to get this in a DSM-4 TR. So, some of these symptoms occur in kids who have not been tortured, but the more you move towards torture, the more I think intense and frequent and kind of global these symptoms become, the more of them you see. The first one we have is, trouble managing feelings and emotions. Just being totally dysregulated. We know that babies and toddlers learn to self-regulate from being regulated by someone else. Most commonly the mother is a primary caregiver of the child. And they depend on that co-regulation, like being held, like being put on mother's chest to feel her heartbeat and her breathing, like being bounced or rocked in order to know how to do that for themselves. Like, my 3-year-old daughter will, if I stroke her hair or something, when I stop, she'll start stroking her own hair in the same way, or she'll take her little stuffed animal and stroke it, have the stuffed animal stroke her, where she's literally repeating the exact same activity as a self-soothing that started and as a self-regulation that started as a co-regulation or outside regulation. Disturbed attachment patterns, we've been talking about that. Rapid shifts in emotional states. So, are you having a good day, or is this more of a bad day with your symptoms? Can change very rapidly depending on, both environmental and internal factors. Regression, he sort of adds in there, means behaving as a much younger child than the child actually is. So, and some of this can be a healthy way to ask for what they need. A child that says, during times of stress or fear, "Mommy, will you hold me like a baby?" even though they're 4 or 5 years old, or, "I want my pacifier," or "I want, to do something, hold my little teddy bear the way I held it when I was 2, even though I'm now 12 years old. A lot of times with young kids, toddlers, you see regression in potty training, like they lose some of the skills that they've had. And so it can be a symptom as well as a coping skill. From my perspective as a clinician that worked with very young kids, when I worked with ICT survivors, most of them were 3 to 6 years old. And then I would, a different therapist would work with the older siblings, since I had that focus on play-based intervention with real young kids. Loss of autonomous strivings. That sounds like just a very fancy way to say, it doesn't exert the level of autonomy you would expect for a child that age. And I would almost challenge saying loss of autonomous strivings because for a kid who's in a kind of torture environment from the beginning, they never had autonomous strivings that they lost. And so that's even harder, right? To build something that was never there in the first place. Aggressive behavior, that's what you get on referrals. They don't put the internalizing symptoms or necessarily the symptoms that cause the child the most suffering. They put the symptoms that are disruptive to society. And we want to be real conscious that we not overly emphasize treatment of those symptoms, that we stay away from behaviorism with this group, because what we know about human behavior of healthy children, normal children, is not going to apply to ICT survivors. And there have been fairly poor outcomes shown with attempts to do behaviorism and other certain interventions that we'll talk about. Failure to achieve developmental competencies, that's obvious. And that's, Perry's 32 categories. See how you're, mark how you're doing in each one. Those are all, each of those 32 items could be called a developmental competency. Loss of bodily regulation. So these are things that are like the first thing we look at as clinicians. How are you sleeping? How are you eating? Self-care, they sort of use that general term depending on what's normal for the child's age. So for an adolescent, are you taking a shower every day? Are you brushing your teeth once or twice a day? For younger kids, obviously, there's not going to be as much in the way of self-care. And this takes us through the full 13. Altered schemas of the world. Very complex way of saying, talking about internal working models. So if I've been tortured all my life, my internal working model of the world, i.e. my schema of the world, i.e. the way I look at the world, the way I think and feel, is that, maybe I think the world is a dangerous, scary place, or maybe I think the world is kind of okay, but people are scary and dangerous, and people are solely a source of harm, not a source of pleasure, not a source of regulation, not a source of love. You can see if you develop that, how you're going to have a lot of trouble, like if you can't even accept co-regulation when it's offered. And that's something I've seen a lot and leads to those attachment disorder diagnoses. Kids that come into foster care and they fall and bump their knee, and the foster mom goes to scoop them up and love on them, and they hate it, and they run away, and they hit the foster mom, and they hide under a table, because they don't even understand the concept that a person can be a source of something positive. Expectations of continuing harm. That's kind of what we already just said, but I guess I'm glad that van der Kolk made it real specific. Because, I get a lot of stuff. I've mostly worked with little kids, but advised and helped with some cases of teenage girls that were real severe cases. And a lot of those girls ended up in residential treatment. And the staff was unprepared for their expectations of continuing harm. And I think that's one we don't want to miss. Multiple somatic problems. I feel like having this be one of 13 things is almost not enough. I would say somatic problems could be half or more than half, depending on the kid, of the suffering from experiencing ICT and other forms of torture. As Judy mentioned, and we go into a lot more detail about it in the introductory training, but sorry, let me take a breath. Judy, what was I just lost my point there. What was I on?
We're on the same page, because I was just going to make the point, I believe. It's kind of the issue here. The underlying concept of developmental trauma is really critical, because what it means, development happens in a sequence, and the earlier developmental achievements become building blocks for everything else. And severe torture, deprivation, isolation, all of that deprives kids of the fundamental earlier building blocks that allow them to build on other as they grow. They use those as the foundation for additional developmental growth. And everything that you're seeing here in all of these indicators, all of these signs, basically suggests that the children have not developed competencies that they should have based on their age. And what that means is that the earlier this kind of maltreatment starts, the more severe it is, the more deficits you will see in some of the basic fundamental skills. And as the kids become older, they become more and more behind because they don't have the foundational stuff to build on. And I don't, Pamela, I'm not sure if that's where you were going
No,
with it.
I remember now. So what
Okay.
I was going to say, when I got to somatic problems, what this keeps making me think about that maybe we will add to this training in the future is, you know, in the first paper and first webinar, we talk a lot about looking at torture in general and how, because there's a ton of literature on torture of adults, torture of POWs, torture of children in a political context. So like trying to get information out of the parent or harm the parent by torturing the child, a political group or, you know, military, whatever it might be. But so much of these, some of these symptoms are specific to being a child when you're tortured. And some of them are common among all types of torture survivors, including this somatic stuff. So we know from what's called stress studies, because they conceive of stress as being, you know, traumatic stress at one end and medium stresses and minor stresses, but that some people experience them primarily as psychiatric symptoms. Some people experience them primarily as physical health symptoms, and most people are somewhere in the middle. So, you know, the list of stress-related somatic problems that you might see in an ICT survivor is very long. It's sort of not doing it justice just to say, oh, you know, tummy aches and headaches. I mean, those are the top two you look at with young children that they complain of, but we're talking about people with, you know, completely debilitating migraines, fibromyalgia, actual like organ dysfunction, which can be from stress or related to things like food and water deprivation. Major medical problems is maybe what I will put my own on here. Van der Kolk's language is multiple somatic problems from GI to headaches, but major medical problems as a result of stress or direct harm. Lack awareness of danger and resulting self-endangering behaviors. This always makes me think of a real little guy that came in for therapy with me once, just turned 3 years old. Mom had a lot of issues, but she wanted to help him, and she would say, you know, he goes to run out in the street and I have to grab him, or he goes to touch the oven and I have to grab him. I said, well, he's 3, you know, maybe this is more about helping mom with her confidence and stuff. But as I learned more about the family and trauma history, you know, what I was able to assess is that this was way, way beyond what a normal 3-year-old does. He really could not conceptualize danger in a way that he should have been able to. He should have had that developmental competency. And so that's kind of my example of it. You know, we also know teenagers are terrible at risk assessment when they sort of plan their own behaviors or act impulsively. And so we want to think about this as well. If, you know, we need to keep clients safe. You know, do we have an adolescent that's already suffering from adolescence and then dually suffering from the effects of torture in families and doing a very poor job of assessing danger. Self-hatred and self-blame. Obviously, you know, we know that younger children want to believe that their parents are good. And we see this even in cases of torture. And even in cases of kids you think would be old enough to be, you know, savvy to this. Like, let's say kids, you know, kind of in the 9 to 12 preteen space. I have seen that will say, well, I was bad and I, you know, broke these rules. And it's my fault that dad did X, Y, and Z, torture acts to me. We always want to be ready for that, even when we think surely, a 10-year-old realizes that being tortured by your parent is not your fault. And this chronic feelings of ineffectiveness, this kind of feels very related to the other category they had about autonomous strivings, where I think, there's this, if you perceive yourself as totally incompetent and ineffective, you're not going to go out and be autonomous. And, you're, for many of these kids, they arrive at age 18 and the end of formal foster care, without the type of confidence and autonomy that you need to go out and make your way in the world. So we want to, plan for this, and also figure out, how do we treat it and what are the possibilities with neuroplasticity?
And I want to summarize and try to articulate what my point was.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. There are two ways of looking at this. This looks like a lot of pathology, looks like a lot of things wrong with kids. But if you're a developmentalist, you ask, what didn't they get when they should have that would have enabled them to behave differently than they're behaving now? And the whole concept of developmental trauma, and you see the same thing with Perry's neurosequential dynamics, listing out stages. If it's because the child was deprived of the opportunity to develop the essential skills, including self-management skills, anything having to do with their ability to master themselves in the world, your therapy is going to address development from the beginning. And I just want to stress, because you're going to look at a lot of different therapeutic interventions, and they are all developmental in nature. We're not approaching it as if the child has multiple pathologies and addressing it at that level. So I just wanted to stress the concept of development and how important it is when we're looking at treatment for these kids, which probably overstates the case about 6 times. But if you take nothing away from this training, other than that, it will have been worth it, because it's a totally different perspective on how you deal with kids.
And Judy has been real helpful to me in developing the ideas in this training. She has a background as a developmental psychologist. And so I really have appreciated her contribution to developing these ideas. So, so that's van der Kolk and his 13 symptoms of developmental trauma disorder. Interestingly enough, sorry, I keep changing the slide. When van der Kolk submitted his materials, the results of his field trials, his empirical evidence for a developmental trauma disorder, and he submitted it to the American Psychiatric Association to get it included in DSM-5. He received a rejection letter from them, and he actually publishes the rejection letter in his book that came out in 2015 called The Body Keeps the Score. He's got an article and a book with the same name. They said to him in the rejection letter that there is no evidence that trauma causes developmental issues. Even though, van der Kolk himself, Judith Herman, Bruce Perry, and the dozens and dozens and dozens of other top scholars that I don't know all the names of, have proven that it is, in fact, not just a little bit developmentally disruptive, but fundamentally developmentally disruptive. So it's very interesting, and I'll be very interested to see in the DSM-5 TR, and someday when we get a DSM-6, how that science is applied. Any questions from the participants? All right. Got about 40 minutes left. Real quick, this is what the neurosequential model looks like. You do have to be certified by Bruce Perry's Child Trauma Academy to use the specific metric in your work to say that you're doing the neurosequential model therapeutics assessment. But you don't have to have anything to say that you're using his ideas. You're using a neurosequential approach. In fact, some of the other interventions we're going to look at today, for example, there's an intervention called TheraPlay, and there's a TheraPlay Institute. They put in their materials that they use a neurosequential approach, even though it's sort of like Bruce Perry's copyrighted idea. So you can absolutely use all the ideas in here, but you can see they're number 1 to 32, and you have to do the bottom ones before you do the more complex ones. And again, you'll get a copy of the slides, so don't worry about writing down any of this. All right, so we looked at complex PTSD. We looked at van der Kolk's 13 symptoms. We looked at Bruce Perry's 32 symptoms. And we looked at this and said, can we distill this into maybe just like 4 or 5 different ideas or different symptom clusters to help it be more palatable and kind of, help people develop their own assessment strategy for this. And so we would say all of the scholars are, they're seeing psychodevelopmental disruption. That's the term I would use, psychodevelopmental disruption in tortured children, and in these major categories. So having to do with arousal, and that means autonomic arousal, the very baseline, attachment, of course, sensory integration. So through van der Kolk, you can get certified in something that he just very simply calls body-based trauma treatment. And it's all about sensory integration. Emotional regulation, which is different than and more sophisticated, challenging piece than like autonomic regulation. And at the very top, to be a surviving and effective adult, one needs to develop complex cognitions like identity, values, and beliefs. These normally develop during adolescence and can be severely compromised in ICT survivors. All right, before we go on to talk about interventions, any questions about victim impact? All right, we'll keep going. All right, so what are these kids gonna need? And by no means is this an exhaustive list. So they're gonna need what I call psychotherapy plus, which is a really committed, trained psychotherapist that's gonna hopefully take the lead and what this child needs. Very often, if you are the psychotherapist, whether you're a social worker, counselor, psychologist, you may be the most informed person on the team to kind of assess, if kids are getting all the interventions that they need. Medical treatment, obviously, child welfare, educational, spiritual intervention. So let's look at those. And of course, this is just an overview. So psychotherapy, sometimes, social workers might call it psychosocial therapy. And, this case we're maybe, psychodevelopmental. It says we'll take a deep dive. That's when most of the specific interventions that we're going to recommend today take place in the context of psychotherapy, but not all of them are psychotherapy. So success in psychotherapy is usually not possible without the child having a safe and permanent corrective relationship with a primary caregiver. Now, child welfare folks and child welfare courts hate to hear this when I say this, when I've got my therapist hat on, because they know, like, you have to give them therapy for all their traumas now while they're in limbo, while they don't know if they're going to go home to mom, if they don't know if grandma's going to step up and take custody, they don't know if they're going to be freed for adoption and the foster family will adopt them. they want the kids fixed by the end of the case so that they can, factor in a fixed and cured child to the decision making. And hopefully, therefore, a fixed and cured child will be easy for parents to manage and they can reunify. You see where this is going. But I typically will not do really in-depth trauma treatment if that child isn't safe physically. And they're in foster care, they're safe. No, safety is physical, but it's also emotional. And you can't ask children to unpack trauma or many of the interventions that we'll talk about when they don't feel emotionally safe and don't have anybody there to support them through this. So what can you do then? Because they're going to be sent for counseling every week. You can do supportive counseling. And social workers know a lot about that, about just giving social support as a legitimate human services intervention. You can do expressive therapies to give them opportunities to express emotions, things like drawing or painting or using musical instruments or moving or dancing to music, expressive stuff. They also sort of throw animal therapies in there, and I think that those are helpful as well. What we would call a non-directive play therapy, where there's just kind of a playroom set up in a certain way that's evidence-based, and you kind of just let the child lead. So we would also call this child-led play therapy or child-centered play therapy, and you just kind of let them go where they want to go with it. And coping skills. People love to talk about, well, are you giving the child coping skills? I try to stay away from talking about coping skills because I think that the language is largely misunderstood. A lot of times when I've seen in residentials or inpatients where they work with people on coping skills, they give them this list of like what I call hobbies and say, circle the ones that you could use as coping skills. Well, I'm 16 and I just got out of torture. And, when I start to, dissociate, I'm going to, work on my stamp collection. Could work for somebody, but I think, coping skills is sort of often a sort of fake and kind of hollow form of treatment. I would call it maybe, you can help them with co-regulation or self-regulation if it's a older child or adolescent, or you can say, I'm going to start with co-regulation with the healthy, safe person in their life that's here to participate in therapy and be the support person. And that will be their first coping skill, is use of other people as a source of safety. Get a little long-winded on psychotherapy because that's my one of my bigger backgrounds with this population. And the clinician will use developmental and neurosequential theories to assess and plan appropriate treatments once there is that appropriate long-term caregiver. Medical treatment. So again, Dr. John Wright, who is the medical director of the East Carolina University Child Advocacy Center, developed this slide for me, and we have, he was really doing some great work out there regarding ICT. Obviously the doctors think about the terms acute and chronic. Many tortured children will come into care with major injuries and medical problems. I recently had a case brought to my attention where a teenager had run away from torture, and they documented almost like every single inch of his skin, his whole body had some sort of injury. So you have extremes like that, where in that case, it looks, parent torturers are in jail and will probably get a lengthy prison sentence. And then of course you may have a child who has been raised largely in solitary confinement and presents with like disorders of severe deprivation and non-attachment, but not a mark on them. All severely abused children should receive a forensic interview and a forensic medical exam. I think, you know, we tend to just think of CACs and forensic evaluations as being for sexual abuse, particularly recent sexual abuse, where there might be evidence to collect on the body. But, you know, forensic interviewers at a CAC are going to do the best job of getting the kid's story. And I really encourage, a lot of times, you know, I've had child welfare workers who work for Child Protective Services will say, well, I have to interview them first, or I have to interview them next. And, you know, the type of questions they plan to ask or the approaches they plan to use are actually like not consistent with getting what I'm going to call a forensically sound statement from the child. So, you know, go rely on the experts to get the kid's story, you know, have them checked out medically, even if you think there's nothing there, there might be something, certainly. And that also, you know, Dr. Wright doesn't really emphasize for me that the forensic pediatrician, even in the one visit, is supposed to be the first step in getting the child engaged with appropriate medical care. So setting up regular primary care, standard screenings that the child's probably missing, vaccines they're probably missing, treatment of chronic issues, setting up specialists if needed, and use of foster care clinics where a child may move from foster home to foster home in a large, you know, greater city area, but they always return to that same clinic for medical care. And for that reason, getting the forensic pediatrician to do that role means that you need to send everybody. And you know, there may be some medical issue that the child hasn't disclosed, but when the pediatrician knows how to ask, they might say, oh, you know what, I do have tummy aches all the time. You know, I had a kid once that said, well, that's just stress. But then, you know, he talked enough with the pediatrician and did some testing. The child had terrible stomach ulcers. So my recommendation is don't skip the Child Advocacy Center. Child welfare intervention. You know, if there's one thing that I would want to communicate to child welfare is we've got to identify these cases and we've got to identify them as torture so that we don't, you know, do the wrong thing, you know, because if it's physical abuse this one time and we don't know about the whole torture, you know, kids may not get rescued. They may get rescued and sent home. I was recently an expert witness in a case where that actually happened. You know, and so you got to be ready for that. You know, child welfare has a big job, and I don't, you know, I respect so much what they do and what they have to deal with. They have to deal with assessing imminent risk and future risk. And we believe that both of those are high, especially if the child has made a disclosure. A lot of times parents will retaliate with even worse torture. Permanency obviously is something that child welfare is responsible for. And we obviously recommend permanent removal of children who have been tortured. Primarily because, you know, our case data, our clinical data really indicates that these parents, you know, propensity to torture and get somebody else to torture and somebody else to torture tends to be really chronic and not responsive to treatment. There are no empirically validated, I mean, there are no intervention programs at all for torturers. There's nothing that says, hey, you know, were you a political torturer in a third world country? Did you torture your child? You know, come get this program, this counseling, this intervention to rehabilitate. Most torturers will never admit anyways that they have that problem or participate, because of course that could lead to criminal consequences. But I once had a court, a child protection court, order the father torturer to participate in counseling as a rehabilitative intervention. And they asked me to help with the referral. And so the referral reason says, tortured kids by doing X, Y, Z to them. And I'll remember all my life getting a call from that therapist that got that referral. And she called me up and said, "What? I don't do torture rehabilitation," So all things for child welfare to keep in mind. And to keep in mind also, the option to go straight to termination of parental rights, so that these kids can get, have it be over. I fundamentally believe that all children have a human right to be free of their torturer, regardless of who that person is. And they have a right to be rescued and be freed from them as soon as possible. Judy, did you want to say
Yeah,
something?
I want to add one thing. I want to back it up. This is listed under as a child welfare intervention, and risk and safety assessment are in fact primary child welfare interventions, but that doesn't mean that professionals in other professions don't need to be equally competent in recognizing and assessing risk when they see it. And you have to understand the dynamics of risk, the fact that children may be more vulnerable based on their age or developmental status, high safety threats, things that exist in the environment that are very detrimental to children's health and development. The important one is parental protective capacities. Do the parents have the capacity to manage the environment and their own parenting to reduce and to protect the child from risk factors that exist? And if you understand that, you're going to be in a much better position to recognize kids who are at high risk of harm. Our contention is children in situations of torture in their families are at extremely high, imminent, meaning immediate risk, and extremely high long-term future risk, which supports our contention that reunification is not the best option for most of these kids. But it's another conversation for another day, but we recommend that you fully understand the concept of risk and risk assessment and integrate it in your work when you're doing assessments of these kids, no matter what context you're in or what profession you're in.
Yep. And, if you're the child welfare worker that's struggling with a case that you think is ICT, and you're not sure about how to use the ICT language or anything like that, reach out to us. I get emails from folks all over the country all the time with questions about cases, and we'll always try to point you to, an answer somewhere in the literature or assist however we can. I've done some consulting and expert witness work on these. So, definitely feel like you can engage with us and send an email. We're going to quickly move a little more quickly because we've got about 22 minutes left. Education, a lot of these kids are going to need an IEP or some sort of individualized education, depending on whether, they attended school, whether they were, many torturing parents either actually homeschool their kids in order to keep them concealed from the public, or they report that they're homeschooling but don't actually ever teach the kids anything. And there's a great organization out there that advocates for homeschool children for interventions that would allow homeschool children to be discovered as tortured or abused if needed. Spiritual intervention, I think, Victor Veith has added so much with this for kids who are religious or who have spiritual kind of existential questions like, why did this happen to me? Why would God let this happen? You know, do I even care about God and God let this happen? These are tough questions that require a lot of cultural sensitivity, religious sensitivity. They're difficult things. And so Victor Vieth recommends that if either the child is religious themselves and poses some of these questions, or if there was religious motives or religious content to the torture, that the child receives spiritual care. The ideal person, Vieth and I agree to provide spiritual care as a professional chaplain. A professional chaplain is someone who has to have a graduate degree in chaplaincy and is trained to provide what I'm going to call religiously non-specific spiritual care. So they don't approach the child as Christian or Muslim or anything like that, but just as somebody who has training to talk with folks about these kinds of issues and respect their spiritual beliefs, or maybe challenge them if needed. So you can go on your own and find out all about professional chaplains. There are places all over the country that are adding professional chaplains to their multidisciplinary teams to think about these issues. And I think that's really fantastic. Okay, so we're going to give you a whole list of interventions here. And each intervention could have its own training on how you do it. This is going to be a very brief overview. We're not going to go through every single point on the slides. I have some real word heavy slides so that when you get the slides, you can go back and have this information written down. The interventions we're going to show you are been proven effective, empirically validated with children suffering from severe developmental trauma or severe child abuse, because ICT is a brand new concept, and I are writing the first papers on ICT. We do not yet have studies that say, specifically ICT kids, TheraPlay works this well and addresses these symptoms. We're going to get there someday, and it's going to be really exciting when we do that. But because, we conceive of a world of severe, a set of severe child abuse, and within that set are ICT cases, we feel that any of these are going to be at least somewhat effective and really worth doing with ICT survivors. And further, all of these have been used with actual ICT child survivors. I've used quite a few of them. My colleagues have used other ones. So we do have case data that says ICT kids were helped by these. So here we go. We already talked about neurosequential model of therapeutics for assessment and treatment planning. So we'll just move right past that. Body-based trauma treatment, I mentioned to you, is something that Van der Kolk gives out certificates that say you're certified in this. And it's, based on a very simple idea that I think, we forget sometimes in Western thought, that trauma is experienced, that we are bodies. We are not just a mind in a vat. We are bodies as human beings, and trauma is experienced in the body, not just the mind. So things like deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, yoga, Van der Kolk is a huge fan of, neurofeedback, things that are sensory integration. All of these are going to be super helpful. Van der Kolk says the goal is to achieve biological homeostasis, which you could say that in so many different ways that are simpler. I think it's really helpful that he says it that way, but Perry might call it regulation in all of the 32 areas, biological homeostasis and sensory integration. And you see, I'm going to move through these quickly just to give you an idea this exists. You can look at the slides later and get on Google and, Google the crap out of this and figure out what you want to get trained in. Yoga therapy. So Van der Kolk and his colleagues have done randomized controlled trials showing that doing yoga therapy with a trained yoga therapist reduced the symptoms of PTSD just as much as people who were assigned to different traditional treatments. Like they had a group assigned to talk therapy only or to psych meds only, and yoga was just as helpful as either of these. And obviously you would probably combine yoga with other treatments. TheraPlay, I'm a really big fan of. I was lucky enough that I got to do like a full week-long training in TheraPlay several years ago, and I used it a lot with ICT survivors. TheraPlay is theraplay.org. They have a TheraPlay Institute. They have trainers. They have Train the Trainers. It's a pretty elaborate program that they run. TheraPlay has been around since the late 1960s. It is designed to improve and enhance the caregiver-child relationship. I would not use this with like a torturing parent and their child. This would be to use with the child and the foster parent or relative that's going to have them permanently, adoptive family, where the child does activities, games, and songs that, and I'm right here, that replicate the infant caregiver experience. We talked before about like, a child that wants to be held like a baby or different things like that. This would be exactly what we're doing in TheraPlay. TheraPlay is very generous in that you do not have to have a certification from them to say that you're doing TheraPlay. And you can get their book and skip right to the end where they have an appendix where they tell you all the different games, songs, activities that you should do, that you can do based on the person's age. And someone mentioned at the very beginning, they had a young adult child who had suffered torture. Up here they say, for adolescents, 13 to 17 years old, here's activities you can do to, how you do TheraPlay. I don't see any reason why you couldn't do this with a 18-year-old, 21-year-old, or even a middle-aged adult. I mean, some of this is just stuff that, I would tell the kids, we're going to get your warm fuzzies going. More scientific than that, but one way to describe it. So highly recommend TheraPlay with this population and other populations too, like just kids getting adopted in general and needing to have that bond with the new primary caregiver. Attachment, regulation, and competency, which is referred to as ARC. We've been using these words all day: attachment, co-regulation and self-regulation, developmental competencies. This is sort of a component-based treatment that you would do. You could do it in talk therapy. You could do it as far as just a general approach of residential staff. It's been used for, you can use it in a lot of different contexts. So we want to help the child develop a healthy attachment to a permanent caregiver. We want to help them with all levels of regulation. So that autonomic arousal, and then mood, and then emotions. And we want to build a sense of competence instead of helplessness into their identity. This is called AVC, Attachment and Biobehavioral Catch-Up. This is a home visiting program. There's great empirical evidence for home visiting programs in general and prevention of child maltreatment just in general. The way that you would use this with the ICT population, you would not use this with a torturing parent. You would use this with a foster or adoptive parent who might be struggling, or they're not struggling, but the child is struggling. This is really, it's the same stuff we've been talking about. You got to have that attachment. You got to meet the developmental competencies or catch up on the ones that you missed. And so that's what this is all about. And so the person that does this, that provides the service, does not have to be a psychotherapist, although I think they can be. But you, for this, you would need to get formally trained to say that you're doing the AVC home visiting program. Trust-based relational intervention was something that I learned about just in the last couple of years. And again, see all these concepts that are starting to circle back and talk about the same things. Trust-based, that would be, having to do with attachment, people as a source of comfort and regulation. It's a caregiving model, so you could use this in therapy and a parent group and all sorts of different contexts. But they have three major things that they focus on. Empowering the child by meeting their ecological and physiological needs. Those of you who are social workers, we can think about like the eco map and making use of that. And I encourage you to Google what is an eco map to get information on that. Connecting, meeting the child's attachment needs of awareness, engagement, attunement, and co-regulation. These are words that all come from, anything that calls itself an attachment-based therapy. Particularly awareness would be just like attunement. And I love that they talk about co-regulation. And then their third area is called correcting, teaching children self-regulation that hopefully will flow out of co-regulation, appropriate boundaries, healthy behaviors, some of those kind of externalizing stuff. I'm going to move even more quickly here so we have time for questions at the end. Anytime you're working with kids 8 years old and younger, you should be doing almost solely play-based therapy interventions. Eliana Gill is a well-known scholar in play therapy in general, and she developed this idea called integrated play therapy. And I encourage you to take a look at that. There is an association for play therapy that gives out credentials that will tell you, so-and-so is a registered play therapist. It's an incredibly difficult credential to get and takes years and years and years. I've seen people work 5 or 10 years to meet all the requirements. And nobody owns the term play therapy. So you can say, I'm doing play-based therapy, I'm doing play-based interventions. If you get a lot of training, you can say I'm doing play therapy. You shouldn't refer to yourself as a play therapist without having that credential. Circle of security, we talk about. This is a manualized 20-week treatment. And this was, I had a phone call with Neil Boris, who I don't know, a few years ago was still the head of Circle of Security. And we talked about ICT, and he specifically recommended Circle of Security for the ICT population. Neurofeedback, very popular lately, lots of great science to back it up. Expressive therapies we talked about earlier, including animal therapy. It might be for some children, they're so afraid of other human beings that they first need to learn, but they feel safe with animals, and they can learn some of the real basics of just interacting with another creature. It doesn't have to be a human being that might prepare them then to interact with human beings later on. TFCBT, I am certified in TFCBT. I think it's an excellent intervention for your last intervention before the child completes psychotherapy. There's some evidence, and Judith Herman has an article where she cites them. We can get that to you if you're interested, where she's showed that using exposure therapy or cognitive therapies early on with really severely abused folks can actually be harmful. And there's a lot of other types of treatment that need to be done first before you expose people to their previous torture or ask them to, tell them that their thoughts about their torture are wrong or inaccurate. So I won't go any further on that. So resources for you on intrafamilial child torture. I am just thrilled that we've now had our materials accessed by folks from, we're up to 82 countries now, in every region of the world, every continent. Centerforchildpolicy.org. You can click on intrafamilial child torture and find our papers, our case studies. I did a couple of amicus briefs for cases before the Ohio Supreme Court where a child had been tortured and the grandmother was suing. We'll have, as soon as we get this posted, there'll be 2 free webinars that are linked up through YouTube. You can find my speaking schedule on our website under events and trainings. I only have, I think, like one thing left this year, and it's not even on ICT. So stay tuned. We'll get a 2023 calendar out soon. And if you need a consultant, if you want to have more training, if you have technical questions, IHS does more than just ICT. ICT is my part of the Center for Child Policy, which is run by IHS. But get in touch with IHS. I think I've got the very next slide has the web address, and you'll get those slides. They provide all sorts of training and technical assistance regarding multiple topics in child maltreatment, and they have been around for, I don't even know how many decades. I want to say at least 40 years. So they have a really impressive history of being a leader in the field of child maltreatment. And here we go. So Center for Child, we mostly go by Center for Child Policy now. You can see there the web address for the Institute for Human Services. It's IHS-train. It's like TrainNet, but just with one N.com. And you can see there my email address and if you're interested in expert witness services, we do that outside of IHS. And so you can take a look at my personal website there for some information. Now I would like to open it up for questions or comments because we often, learn things just from listening to other people add comments that when I speak. You guys have a lot of experience to add to this as well. So Judy, do we have any questions or comments yet?
No questions. Feel free to type them in as we're doing this. Deborah, thank you. Deborah apparently has a case. Sounds like it's a very egregious child torture case, and she just said she will be in touch, so that's fine. Potentially to be involved in the study, to provide information of the study. Any of the rest of you, with 22 people, we should have everybody on screen and be able to have a conversation, but I don't think the webinar allows it. So type in anything you want or contact us. Be glad to talk with you and provide you with any other information that would be useful to you.
Yep, I'll wrap up by saying thank you so much for being with us today. I'm really passionate about this topic, and we'll continue to work on developing new ideas and new science in the area of ICT. And if you do have cases to contribute or thoughts or ideas about maybe you've seen torture but you're not sure, get in touch with us. We would love just more and more people to participate in this big data collection that we're going to do, both quantitative and qualitative, your ideas, your experiences. So hope to connect with you further along those lines. Feel free to email me or at the Policy Center, IHS websites. I'm sure there are places where it says, contact us, and you can do that way as well. Thank you again.
Yeah, Jeff says, really appreciate the training. Lots of good information, some quite surprising. And actually, that's the purpose of good training. Thank you for informative training, information that all child protective services should have. Great knowledge of the topic displayed. Wonderful information. Thank you for the feedback. I said that, they didn't. Thank you so very much. You want to know what was surprising? Yes, yeah. So do I. Jeff, do you want to type in what surprised you the most?
And while Jeff is typing, I'm just gonna address the ones of you who have paid already for your certificates. You're required to complete a survey, which I'm going to post the link in the chat right now, so you can go in the chat, copy the link, and paste it in your browser and complete it. It's going to take you up to 7 minutes, maybe. We'll really appreciate. But those of you who are attending for free, we encourage you to complete the survey, because we really look at the feedback and we really need it. So we'd appreciate if all and every one of you completed the survey. So the link is in the chat right now. You can go ahead and copy it. We're also going to mail you the handouts and the link again to the certificate, and you're given 1 week, 7 days to complete the survey. I'm sorry, and then on the 8th day, in about a week, basically, we will send you your certificates, CE certificates. If you have any,
I didn't know if it was clear because you said mail. You'll get an email with the slides in the form of a PDF.
Yeah.
Judy, anything else?
Yeah, so Jeff said he was surprised that yoga is as effective as therapy. Think back to to do yoga, it's relaxation, it's awareness of your body position, and it's a body-based therapy. And if you go back to the basics, children need to learn to regulate their own feelings, autonomic arousal, relaxation. I mean, so in that respect, that's the short version about why these body-based therapies are really good for kids who've never lived without anxiety. And
I'll add something real quick. And I use what they call baby yoga in my therapy with littles. So it's not just for like adults doing complicated yoga. Anybody can do basic positions. Go ahead, Judy.
That's all. Just gonna say it stresses that you have to start with the basics with these kids who've been very severely maltreated. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
If you don't have any more questions, I'm just gonna go ahead and close the session. You will
right.
see when I close the session, you should see the link to the survey as well.
Yeah. Thank you all very much for coming and staying, and hope it was useful. Let us know.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
See you at our other trainings.
Bye.